the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan, and in for Amy is former ABC7 political reporter and radio talk show host, Charles Thomas.
That's me.
That is you. And Charles, as I often say, you can learn a lot about playing the game of geopolitics from great works of literature like J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And I'm glad to see that Walter Russell Mead, Bard College academic, agrees with me in his piece on Iran. He provides this delightful analogy. He reminds us of elderly King Theoden, staring into his memories as the shadows gather around his endangered realm. Reading from Mead's column. The counselors of decline whisper the logic of despair into his aging years. Saruman, they say, referencing the dangerous wizard building armies and fortifications near Theoden's frontiers, has limited goals, and you can work with him. Besides, Saruman is irresistible, and you can't defeat him. Yes, his warg and orc allies can be a little rough around the edges, but at the end of the day, détente with Saruman offers your best hope for regional peace. Throughout the Obama era and again during the Biden years, the defeatists and Iran apologists whispered and spun. At the same time, the bloody-fingered allies of the Ayatollahs wrought havoc across the Middle East, subjecting Lebanon, subverting Iraq, wrecking Syria, immiserating Yemen, and equipping Hamas for its ruinous war. Meanwhile, the mullahs continued their drive for nuclear weapons and missiles. According to one prominent analyst, they could make a bomb within days and a respectable nuclear arsenal within a few weeks or months. That's terrifying. In Tolkien's world, King Theoden woke up from the spell he was under in the nick of time, dismissed his turncoat counselor Wormtongue, and led his country back into the light. Will Biden do the same? He's got a lot of Wormtongues around him. In fact, he is one. Here's a guy who was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1979 during the hostage crisis that you could argue certainly in part cost Jimmy Carter his presidency. No lessons learned there. Why should he learn any now? For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. He served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 17 to 18. He's also the author of The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge Colby, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
So how do you like Walter Reed's analogy? Walter Russell Mead's analogy.
Well, I always find Walter's pieces illuminating and compelling. I'm not an expert, as much of an expert on the Tolkien as he is, so I won't comment too much. I would say that the main reaction I would have to Walter's articles, and I say this as an admirer and a friend of his, is that I think he grapples well with the challenges of American weakness and the rise of other theaters like Asia, but I don't see him grappling as forthrightly with the difficult trade-offs that we need to make because, our defense industrial base is not where it needs to be. The debt, as Jay Powell said over the weekend, the debt has become a very serious issue. There's a lot of concern about greater spending. So we're in a world of hard choices, and I think I guess literary analogies can be helpful, but I think it should be pretty straightforward. We have tough choices to make, and we need to focus on the things that are the biggest priorities for us.
Well, what's the tough choice as it pertains to Iran?
Well, the tough choice as it pertains to Iran is that we can't afford to get involved into a large Middle East war. You have a number of people out there, actually relatively few, fortunately, but saying, hey, we should bomb Tehran or regime change the Ayatollahs. And, I don't know where these people have been the last 25 years, but we tried that a couple times and have had limited success at best. And more importantly, we can't keep running that playbook because we're behind the Chinese in their military buildup, and that's a much more significant issue. China makes Iran pale in comparison. The Iranian regime and its ideology is a nasty one, there's no question, but they're just a lot less strong than China is. And so you have a lot of people out there kind of acting as if it's 1999, and it's just not. I mean, you look at the situation in Ukraine and the fact that we've run into significant constraints on our ability to produce weapons, and many of those that we've given to the Ukrainians or others, it's going to take years and years for us to replace. In the meantime, Admiral Sam Paparo, who's up to lead the Indo-Pacific Command out in Honolulu, he pointed out the other day in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee that, yeah, people talk about 2027 and Xi Jinping's order to the PLA to be ready by then, but that's just what's called a fourth development goal. They might go tomorrow. They might go in a year. They might go in 5 years. They might never go. But we have to be ready today, tomorrow, and in 5 years. And we need to look at the Iran context in that light. Now, that doesn't mean just rolling over, but it means, like a business that has overextended itself, basically, we've got to, it doesn't mean you close up shop and just give up, but it means you've got to rationalize your strategies and your postures.
Well, it seems there are some easy choices that we can make, too, that we're not making, at least under this administration. For example, enforcement of sanctions against Iran that were imposed, not trading cash for hostages, restarting our domestic energy production. Certainly not eliminating.
Totally.
So that the world is less reliant. We're less reliant on bad actors. They have less money and thus less wherewithal. I mean, these are some easy choices we could make, right?
Totally. I mean, this administration's policy is bewildering at best and catastrophically self-defeating at worst. Why would we stop energy production when it's great for American growth? It diminishes the influence of countries like Iran and Russia. Why wouldn't we put significant, even maximum economic pressure on Iran? Why wouldn't, instead of, I saw recently the Biden climate czar, White House climate czar, and the way he was talking was like they'd been handing out billions of dollars to green energy startups. Why didn't we invest some of that enormous amount of money earlier in this administration in the defense industrial base? That would make sense. You got the President of the United States saying, hey, we're America. Well, our defense industrial base isn't where it needs to be. So there's some basic things that we should do. And there's also the whole approach that the president seems to take in his administration, which is to allow Iran to precisely calculate and calibrate how far it can push us. That's not smart. With President Trump or President Nixon, you go back, you couldn't necessarily, President Eisenhower, you couldn't calculate how he might respond. It didn't mean that he was necessarily going to respond maximally to everything, because then you get in unnecessary wars. But President Biden is incredibly calculable, and I think that's a lot of what's going on, where they're bombing throughout the Middle East, Yemen, et cetera, and by their own admissions, it's continuing to happen. So it's not succeeding.
Right, and so and then the flip side too. You mentioned Ukraine because this is all tied up in that Senate immigration bill that dropped on Sunday that we've been discussing the last couple of days, as everybody, and it's so the EU just gave $54 billion to Ukraine. And now it seems like, we have to give $60 billion to them because we have to keep pace. We have to keep pace with our EU. We're partners in peace and this and that. And if we don't, then we're going to get our finger wagged at us by European countries.
We're definitely getting our finger wagged. Trust me, I know that.
Yeah, saying where is United States? Where is United States leadership? It's such a bait. It's like you're not man enough to support Ukraine. What's going on? And no, we're going to be there whether it makes sense or not.
Yeah, no. Look, I think there's obviously huge problems with the border bill on the border security front, and others are more expert to comment on that. But I think there are very, very compelling concerns and doubts about that. But I would just say the priorities in that bill are wildly mixed up. We're sending $61 billion to Ukraine, whereas we know that China's our top threat, and we're way behind where we need to be. So if anything, it should be reversed. And I agree with you. My point has been since the beginning of the war. It's not that the Russians are the good guys. They're not. Their invasion of Ukraine is an evil act. But look, it's in Europe. The Europeans are incredibly wealthy economies. They have not been spending enough on their own security. And the old kind of Uncle Sugar model just ain't going to work anymore. It doesn't mean we get out of NATO, but it means we have more of an equal partnership. And honestly, and I talk to them a lot, and the finger wagging is right. There's a kind of combination of finger wagging and panic and petulance and and it's like, look, people, I almost feel like just grow up. You got to take care of your own stuff. The fact that you're spending more is great. That's great. I encourage you. They've obligated $50 billion over. I think it's over at least a couple years, but that's great. Okay. But the American people, A, have bigger problems internationally in Asia that we're behind on. B, there's the border. C, there's increasing concerns about the amount of money we've spent. And D, by the way, the American people are sick and tired of foreign interventions. So, that's just, that old way is done. And I think the right way of looking at things is putting Americans' interests first. Now, that doesn't mean just withdrawing from the world, but it means being a lot more calibrated in how we engage, especially militarily in the world. And it means really demanding that our allies step up more. And I don't know how people can actually resist that. And I think part of the panic and the sort of ad hominem attacks come from a recognition at some level that, of course, it's ridiculous to oppose that line because that's the only sustainable way forward.
Right, and so it's their backyard too. Oh, by the way, not ours, but
exactly. They should be paying more for it because it's in their front yard, backyard, whatever. Like it's right next to them. It's far from us. Why are we? One of the guys who's one of the big poobahs I was just on tour with, he used to run the Munich Security Council. He said, American leadership for 70 years creates responsibility for Americans. I was like, well, actually the fact that Americans have been contributing disproportionately for 70 years, doesn't that mean you owe us, if anything? And B, you're German. Like, do I need to go there? Like, if anything, the American people, we're already paying 3+% of GDP. The notion that we owe something to them is facially absurd, and no adult in their private life or in their commercial life would ever adopt this kind of attitude. The problem is that our elite, our blob elite, has cultivated this because they personally and as a class benefit from this. And I don't want to get too Marxist, but there's a mismatch between the foreign policy elite and the interests of the Americans, and that is now done. President Trump and others are trying to rectify that so that we can put it on a more sustainable basis, I think.
Right. I mean, this is the mentality with everything, to create dependence. And so you've got Western Europe is a bunch of house cats because of the last 70 years. Well, it's time to go outside, Yeah,
and they're it's not like they're poor anymore. They were destroyed. Like they're top. Most advanced semiconductors are designed by a Dutch firm. They build Airbus. They're not children. If anything, we're the children. They're the adults, right? Many of us came from there. So, don't give me this children stuff. That's just the con. I'm watching my wallet,
One thing, because Chuck Schumer, again, making the case for the Senate immigration bill, mainly it seems to fund Ukraine, $60 billion, as we were saying. He said, he trotted out the old line of argumentation about Putin's revanchism and that, we either provide the funding now to help Ukraine repel the Russians or we're going to be fighting, and he implied boots on the ground in Eastern Europe in 3 years. Even if you believe that Putin has his sights set beyond Ukraine to restore the motherland, does it necessarily follow that we should be providing the funding that Chuck Schumer desires?
I agree with Senator Schumer that there's a serious danger from the Russians. I think they are rearming. I will say that they are not the Red Army of Marshal Zhukov or of 1965. They are a far cry from that. They're having difficulty just with Ukraine. So they are not going to roll to the English Channel, but they are a major threat to Eastern NATO, so I think we should take it seriously. Mm-hmm. But given the fact that Senator Schumer has been quite a big, raised the alarm on China over the years, given that we face a much bigger threat, and by the way, our close ally Israel is also fighting, if not for its life, then, something close to it, we got a lot of other problems. So, the logical deduction from that to me is not to, harangue and the American people, but to say to Europe, wow, yeah, why don't you just spend what you committed to spend 10 years ago? So we have European politicians like the former NATO Secretary General and Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen coming to Washington and lecturing us about the need to spend. And I'm thinking to myself, well, is Denmark spending 2%? The answer is no. Did NATO countries meet their spending commitments or raise defense spending to an adequate level when you were Secretary General? No. Well, remove the mote from thy own eye, friend. Foreign Secretary David Cameron, who, by the way, was the architect of a real soft policy towards China when he was Prime Minister and was responsible for significant cuts to the British military, is lecturing the American people. I mean, the audacity, honestly. The audacity, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And this is not because I'm anti-NATO. I'm pro-NATO. But if you've got something that's fundamentally unworkable and unsustainable, it's going to break down. So, to me, I believe I'm a better friend to the Europeans than those who are saying, don't worry about these skeptical voices, just keep shoveling money. No, and over the last couple of years, I've been trying to raise the alarm on this point. And you've had including a lot of leading Republicans from the older generation saying, don't listen to these people who are skeptical. Who was a better friend of the Europeans? I think it would have been better if the Europeans had understood from the beginning that American aid to Ukraine would be limited and time-bound and more focused, which is the argument that I've been making, and that they needed to step up so that if they believe their own rhetoric, they would take commensurate action. But what's disturbing is that they talk a big game. I'll give you an example. Prime Minister Sunak of the United Kingdom, the UK has been sending all kinds of politicians over to lecture the American people about the need to spend more money. His chief of army said a week or so ago, that the threat from Russia required a fundamental overhaul of the British military and possibly conscription. Okay, sounds like the guy's taking him seriously, right? You know what Sunak did? He shot him down. Well, that tells us a lot. So you're trying to get the American people to send $61 billion when we're already in bad shape in a lot of ways? I mean, give me a break.
Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 17 to 18. He's also the author of the book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Elbridge Colby, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning